first in a series of forums. I've been wanting to invite Neil Postman to Apple for many years, and I finally got an opportunity when I found out he was going to be down in Los Angeles this week visiting one of his children who's working in the computer business as well, and tried to think of how to introduce him. I think people that are here because they already feel that they know him through his writing. So best I could come up with was to remember that in several of Plato's dialogues, Socrates, who I think is almost everybody's favorite philosopher, we found some very strange things that Socrates said. One of them was that he didn't like writing, something that we think is very important. And one of the reasons he didn't like writing was he said it forces you to follow an argument rather than to participate in it. So he thought of it as being alienating. And in particular, the thing he didn't like about writing was that somebody could write something down and then go off and die, and you could never track them down to convince them they were wrong. This thing that they had. So even back then, they realized that writing wasn't just transcribing oral speech, but it actually changed the modes of thought and the kinds of discourse you were going to do because it existed. And we've had many examples of that since then. We see that the printing press wasn't like the manuscript book. It changed things tremendously. Television wasn't like the media that came before it. And at some point in this century, people started thinking about it in a much stronger way, that media wasn't innocent when it took on a message, because you had to change yourself in order to get that message. And the interesting thing about media was not the messages that were sent on it, but the changes that happened to you as a result of deciding to use it as a way of communication. I think the person over the last 25 years who's been the most profound thinker and observer of these ideas in many different areas has been Neil Postman. Most of the ideas and patterns of thought that I think have been most powerful to me, I've gotten one way or another from reading his writings. One of his recent books is called Amusing Ourselves to Death, which is basically saying that we worried about 1984 and the Orwell vision, but we should have been worried about Brave New World, because we have a culture that controls with pleasure rather than with pain. Television was one of the manifestations of that. Today, I've asked Neil to come and talk to us not about amusing ourselves to death, but about informing ourselves to death.
Thank you, Alan. The great English playwright and social philosopher George Bernard Shaw once remarked that all professions are conspiracies against the common folk. He meant that those who belong to elite trades, physicians, lawyers, teachers, and scientists, for example, protect their special status by creating vocabularies that are incomprehensible to the general public. And this process prevents outsiders from understanding what the profession is doing and why, and it protects the insiders from close examination and criticism. Professions, in other words, build forbidding walls of technical gobbledygook over which prying and alien eyes cannot see. Now, unlike Bernard Shaw, I raise no complaint against this because I consider myself a professional teacher and I appreciate technical gobbledygook as much as anyone else. But I don't object if occasionally someone who does not know the secrets of my trade is allowed entry to the inner halls to express an untutored point of view. Such a person may sometimes give a refreshing opinion, or even better, see something in a way that the professionals have overlooked. And so I take the liberty of addressing you this morning for just such a purpose. I don't know very much about computer technology, at least not much more than the average person, which of course isn't very much. I have little understanding of what excites a computer programmer or scientist, and in listening to conversations of computer experts, I find each one more mysterious than the next. So I clearly qualify as an outsider. But I think that what may be wanted here is not merely an outsider, but an outsider who has a point of view that might be useful to the insiders. And that's why I'm here and accepted Alan's invitation to come. I believe I know something about what technologies do to culture, and I think I know even more about what technologies undo to a culture. In fact, I might say at the start that what a technology undoes is a subject that computer experts apparently know very little about. I've heard many experts in computer technology speak about the advantages that computers will bring, with a couple of exceptions. Joseph Weizenbaum, I suppose, would be one, and J. David Bolter another. I haven't read anyone who has written seriously and comprehensively about the disadvantages of computer technology. And that strikes me as odd and makes me wonder if the profession is hiding something important. That's to say, what seems to be lacking among computer experts is a sense of technological modesty. After all, anyone who has studied the history of technology knows that technological change is always a Faustian bargain. Technology giveth, and technology taketh away, and not always in equal measure. A new technology sometimes creates more than it destroys. Sometimes it destroys more than it creates. But it's never one-sided. The invention of the printing press is an excellent example. Printing fostered the modern idea of individuality, but it destroyed the medieval sense of community and social integration. Printing created prose, but made poetry into an exotic and elitist form of expression. Printing made modern science possible, but transformed religious sensibility into an exercise in superstition. Printing assisted in the growth of the nation state, but in so doing made patriotism into a sordid, if not a murderous, emotion. Another way of saying this is that a new technology tends to favor some groups of people and harms other groups. School teachers, for instance, will in the long run probably be made obsolete by television, as blacksmiths were made obsolete by the automobile, as balladeers were made obsolete by the printing press. Technological change always results in winners and losers. Now, in the case of computer technology, there can be no disputing that the computer has increased the power of large-scale organizations like military establishments or airline companies or banks or tax-collecting institutions. It's equally clear that the computer is now indispensable to high-level researchers in physics and other natural sciences. But to what extent has computer technology, at least up to now, been an advantage to the masses of people? To steel workers, vegetable store owners, teachers, automobile mechanics, musicians, bakers, bricklayers, dentists, and most of the rest into whose lives the computer now intrudes. These people have had their private matters made more accessible to private institutions, They are more easily tracked and controlled. They are subjected to more examinations and are increasingly mystified by the decisions made about them. They are more often reduced to mere numerical objects. They are being absolutely buried by junk mail, and they are easy targets for advertising agencies and political organizations. And I might add that the schools teach their children to operate computers instead of teaching things that are much more valuable to children. In a word, almost nothing happens to the losers that they really need, which is, of course, why they are losers. Now, it's to be expected that the winners will encourage the losers to be enthusiastic about computer technology. Well, that's the way of winners. And so they sometimes tell the losers that with personal computers, the average person can balance a checkbook more neatly, keep better track of recipes, make more logical shopping lists, and they also tell them that they can vote at home, shop at home, get all the information they wish at home, and thus make community life entirely unnecessary. They tell them that their lives will be conducted more efficiently, discreetly neglecting to say from whose point of view or what might be the costs of such efficiency. Now, should the losers grow skeptical, the winners dazzle them with the wondrous feats of computers, many of which have only marginal relevance to the quality of the losers' lives, but which are nonetheless impressive. Eventually, the losers succumb, in part because they believe that the specialized knowledge of the masters of computer technology is a form of wisdom. The masters, of course, come to believe this as well. The result is that certain questions do not arise, such as, to whom will the computer give greater power and freedom, and whose power and freedom will be reduced by the computer? Now, if I have made all this sound like a well-planned conspiracy, as if the winners know all too well what is being won and what lost, this is not quite how it happens. For the winners do not always know what they are doing and where it will all lead. The Benedictine monks who invented the mechanical clock in the 12th and 13th centuries believed that such a clock would provide a precise regularity to the 7 periods of devotion they were required to observe during the course of the day. As a matter of fact, it did. But what the monks did not realize is that the clock is not merely a means of keeping track of the hours, but also of synchronizing and controlling the actions of people. And so by the middle of the 14th century, the clock had moved outside the walls of the monastery and brought a new and precise regularity to the life of the workman and the merchant. The mechanical clock made possible the idea of regular production, regular working hours, and a standardized product. Without the clock, capitalism would have been quite impossible. And so here is the great paradox. The clock was invented by men who wanted to devote themselves more rigorously to God. And it ended up as the technology of greatest use to men who wished to devote themselves to the accumulation of money. Technology always has such unforeseen consequences, and it's not always clear at the beginning who or what will win and who or what will lose. I might add, by way of another historical example, that Johann Gutenberg was by all accounts a devoted Christian who would have been horrified to hear Martin Luther, the accursed heretic, declare that printing is God's highest act of grace, whereby the business of the gospel is driven forward. Gutenberg thought his invention would advance the cause of the Holy Roman See, whereas in fact it turned out to bring a revolution which destroyed the monopoly of the Roman Church. Well, we may ask ourselves now then, is there something that the masters of computer technology think they are doing, something that's going on in this building that you think you are doing for all of us, which you may have reason to regret? Well, I think there is. And in the time remaining to me, I want to try to explain what may be dangerous about the computer and why. Of course, I trust that you'll be open enough to consider what this outsider has to say on it. Now, I think I can begin by telling you about a small experiment I've been conducting on and off for the past several years at New York University. There are some people who describe the experiment as an exercise in deceit and exploitation, but I'm going to rely on your sense of whimsy to pull me through here. Here's how it works. It's best done in the morning when I see a colleague who appears not to be in possession of a copy of the New York Times. Did you read the Times this morning, I ask. If the colleague says yes, there's no experiment that day. Now, if the answer is no, the experiment can proceed. You ought to look at page 23, I say. There's a fascinating article about a study done at the University of Minnesota. That's sort of an esoteric sort of place to us New Yorkers, so that's why I choose it. Really, what's it about is the usual reply, and my choices at this point are limited only by my imagination. But I might say something like this. Well, they did this study to find out what foods are best to eat for losing weight. And it turns out that a normal diet supplemented by chocolate eclairs, eaten 6 times a day, is the best approach. It seems that there's some special nutrient in the eclairs, encomial dioxin, that actually uses up calories at an incredible rate. Now, another possibility, which I like to use with colleagues who have lived in California, is this one. I think you'll want to know about this, I say. The neurophysiologists at Johns Hopkins have uncovered a connection between jogging and reduced intelligence. They tested more than 1,200 people over a period of 5 years and found that as the number of hours people jogged increased, there was a corresponding decrease in their intelligence. They don't know exactly why, but there it is. Now, I'm sure by now you understand what my role is in the experiment. To report something that is quite ridiculous. One might say beyond belief. So let me tell you some of my results. Unless this is the second or third time I've tried this on the same guy, most people will believe, or at least not completely disbelieve, what I've told them. Sometimes they say, really, is that possible? Sometimes they do a double take and reply, where'd you say that study was done? And sometimes they say, you know, I've heard something like that. Now, there are several conclusions that can be drawn from these results, one of which was expressed by H.L. Mencken 50 years ago, when he said, there is no idea so stupid that you can't find a professor who will believe it. Well, that's more of an accusation than an explanation, but in any case, I've tried this experiment on non-professors and get roughly the same results. Now, another possible conclusion is one expressed by George Orwell, also about 50 years ago, when he remarked that the average person today is about as naive as was the average person in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, people believed in the authority of their religion, no matter what. Today, we believe in the authority of our science, no matter what. But I think there's still another and more important conclusion to be drawn. It's related to Orwell's point, but rather off at a right angle to it. I'm referring to the fact that for most people, the world in which we live is very nearly incomprehensible. There is almost no fact, whether actual or imagined, that will surprise us for very long, since we have no comprehensive and consistent picture of the world which would make the fact appear as an unacceptable contradiction. We believe because there's no reason not to believe. No social, political, historical, metaphysical, logical, or spiritual reason. We live in a world that for the most part, for most people, makes no sense. Not even technical sense. I mean, I don't mean to try my experiment on this audience, especially after having told you about it. But if I informed you that the seats you are presently occupying were actually made by a special process which uses the skin of a pickled herring, on what grounds would you dispute me? For all you know, indeed, for all I know, the skin of a pickled herring could have made the seats on which you sit, and if I could get an industrial chemist to confirm this fact by describing some incomprehensible process by which it was done, you might tell someone later today that you spent the morning sitting on a pickled herring. Now maybe I can get a bit closer to this point with an analogy. If you opened a brand new deck of cards and started turning the cards over one by one, you'd have a pretty good idea of what their order is. After you had gone from the ace of spades through to the nine of spades, you would expect a 10 of spades to come up next. And if a 3 of diamonds showed up instead, you would be surprised and wonder, what kind of deck of cards is this? But if I gave you a deck that had been shuffled 20 times and then asked you to turn the cards over, you wouldn't expect any card in particular. A 3 of diamonds would be just as likely as a 10 of spades. Having no basis for assuming a given order, you'd have no reason to react with disbelief or even surprise to whatever card turns up. So the point is that in a world without spiritual or intellectual order, nothing is unbelievable, and therefore nothing comes as a particular surprise. In fact, George Orwell was more than a little unfair to the average person in the Middle Ages. The belief system of the Middle Ages was rather like my brand new deck of cards. There existed an ordered, comprehensible worldview, beginning with the idea that all knowledge and goodness come from God. What the priests had to say about the world was derived from the logic of their theology. There was nothing arbitrary about the things people were asked to believe, including the fact that the world itself was created at 9 a.m. on October 23rd in the year 4004 BC. That could be explained and was quite lucidly to the satisfaction of almost anyone. So could the fact that 10,000 angels could dance on the head of a pin. It made quite good sense if you believed that the Bible is the revealed word of God and that the universe is populated with angels. The medieval world was, to be sure, mysterious and filled with terror, but it was not without a sense of order. Ordinary men and women might not clearly grasp how the harsh realities of their lives fit into the grand and benevolent design. But they had no doubt that there was such a design, and their priests were well able, by deduction from a handful of principles, to make it, if not rational, at least coherent. Now, the situation we're in presently is much different, and I should think sadder and more confusing and certainly more mysterious. It's rather like the shuffled deck of cards I referred to. There is no consistent, integrated conception of the world which serves as the foundation on which our edifice of belief rests. And therefore, in a sense, we are more naive than those of the Middle Ages and more frightened, because we can be made to believe almost anything. The skin of a pickled herring makes about as much sense to most people as a vinyl alloy or encomial dioxin. Now, in a way, none of this is our fault. If I may turn the wisdom of Cassius on its head, the fault is not in ourselves, but almost literally in the stars. When Galileo turned his telescope toward the heavens and allowed Kepler to look as well, they found no enchantment or authorization in the stars, only geometric patterns and equations. God, it seemed, was less of a moral philosopher than a master mathematician. And this discovery helped to give impetus to the development of physics, but did nothing but harm to theology. Before Galileo and Kepler, it was possible to believe that the earth was the stable center of the universe and that God took a special interest in our affairs. Afterward, the earth became a lonely wanderer in an obscure galaxy in a hidden corner of the universe, and we were left to wonder if God had any interest in us at all. The ordered, comprehensible world of the Middle Ages began to unravel because people no longer saw in the stars the face of a friend. And something else, which once was our friend, turned against us as well. I refer to what we call information. There was a time when information was a resource that helped human beings to solve specific and urgent problems of their material and psychic environment. In the Middle Ages, there was a scarcity of information, but its very scarcity made it both important and usable, maybe even sacred. And in so doing, created what we now call an information explosion. 40 years after the invention of the press, there were printing machines in 110 cities in 6 different countries. 50 years after, more than 8 million books had been printed, almost all of them filled with information that had previously not been available to the average person. Nothing, in my opinion, could be more misleading than the idea that computer technology introduced the age of information. The printing press began that age, and we have not been free of it ever since. But what started out as a liberating stream has turned into a Niagara of chaos. If I can use our own country as an example, here's what we're faced with. In America, there are 260,000 billboards, 17,000 newspapers, 13,000 periodicals, 27,000 video outlets for renting tapes, 460 million TV sets, and over 600 million radios, not counting those in automobiles. There are 40,000 new book titles published every year, 300,000 worldwide, and every day in America, 41 million photographs are taken. And just for the record, thanks to the computer, over 60 billion pieces of advertising junk mail come into our mailboxes every year. Everything from telegraphy and photography in the 19th century to the silicon chip in the 20th has amplified the din of information until matters have reached such proportions that today, for the average person, information no longer has any relation to the solution of problems. The tie between information and action has been severed. Information is now a commodity that can be bought and sold, or used as a form of entertainment, or worn like a garment to enhance one's status. It comes indiscriminately, directed at no one in particular, disconnected from usefulness. We are glutted with information. We are drowning in information, have no control over it, and don't know what to do with it. And there are two reasons we don't know what to do with it. First, as I have said, we no longer have a coherent conception of ourselves and our universe and our relation to one another and our world. We no longer know, as the people in the Middle Ages did, where we come from, where we are going, and why. In other words, we don't know what information is relevant and what information is irrelevant to our lives. Second, we have directed all of our energies and intelligence to invent machinery that does nothing but increase the supply of information. And as a consequence, our defenses against information glut have broken down. Our information immune system is inoperable. We don't know how to filter it out, we don't know how to reduce it, and we don't know how to use it. We suffer, if I may put it this way, from a kind of cultural AIDS. Now, into this situation, of course, comes the computer. The computer, as you know better than I, has a quality of universality, not only because of its use, that its uses are almost infinitely various, but also because computers are commonly integrated into the structure of other machines. And of course, it would be fatuous, therefore, for me to warn against every conceivable use of a computer. But there's no denying that the most prominent uses of computers have to do with information. When people talk about information sciences, they are talking about computers. How to store information, how to retrieve information, how to organize information. The computer, for most people, is an answer to the questions, how can I get more information faster and in a more usable form? Now, these would appear to be reasonable questions. But now I should like to put some other questions to you that seem to me more reasonable. If there should be a nuclear holocaust, would it happen because of a lack of information? Is the war in Bosnia a result of a lack of information? If children are dying of starvation in Ethiopia, does it occur because of a lack of information? Does racism in South Africa exist because of a lack of information? If criminals roam the streets of New York and Los Angeles, do they do so because of a lack of information? Or let's come down to a more personal level. If you and your spouse are unhappy together and end your marriage in divorce, will it happen because of a lack of information? If your children misbehave and bring shame to your family, does it happen because of a lack of information? If someone in your family has a mental breakdown, will it happen because of a lack of information? Well, I think you'll have to concede that what ails us, what causes us the most misery and pain at both cultural and personal levels, has nothing to do with the sort of information made accessible by computers. The computer and its information cannot answer any of the fundamental questions we need to address to make our lives more meaningful and more humane. The computer cannot provide an organizing moral framework. It cannot tell us what questions are worth asking. It cannot provide a means of understanding why we are here, or why we fight each other, or why decency eludes us so often, especially when we need it the most. The computer is, in a sense, a magnificent toy that distracts us from facing what we most need to confront: spiritual emptiness, knowledge of ourselves, usable conceptions of the past and the future. Now, does one blame the computer for this? Of course not. It is, after all, only a machine, a wonderful one, but only a machine. But it is usually presented to us with trumpets blaring as a technological messiah. Through the computer, the heralds say, "We will make education better." What a joke. We'll make religion better, politics better, our minds better. Best of all, we'll make ourselves better. Well, this is, of course, nonsense, and only the young or the ignorant or the foolish could possibly believe it. Now, I said a moment ago that computers are not to blame for this, and that is true, at least in the sense that we do not blame an elephant for its huge appetite, or a stone for being hard, or a cloud for hiding the sun. That is their nature, and we expect nothing different from them. But the computer has a nature as well. True, it is only a machine, but a machine designed to manipulate and generate information. That is what computers do, and therefore they have an agenda and an unmistakable message. The message is that through more and more information, more conveniently packaged, more swiftly delivered, more neatly organized, we will find solutions to our problems. And so all the brilliant young men and women, believing this, create ingenious things for the computer to do, hoping that in this way we will become wiser and more decent and more noble. Well, who can blame them? By becoming masters of this wondrous technology, they will acquire prestige and power, and some of them will even become famous. In a world populated by people who believe that through more and more information, paradise is attainable, why then the computer scientist is king. But I maintain that all of this is a monumental and dangerous waste of human talent and energy. I also maintain that those geniuses of information technology are not the people to whom we can turn to find the new and life-enhancing narratives with which to survive. They'll give us Star Wars and tell us that's the answer to nuclear war. They'll give us artificial intelligence and tell us this is the way to self-knowledge. They'll give us instantaneous global communication and tell us this is the way to mutual understanding. They'll give us virtual reality and tell us this is the answer to spiritual poverty. But these are only the ways of the technician, the fact-mongerer, the information junkie, and the technological idiot. Here's what the American philosopher Henry David Thoreau told us. All our inventions are but improved means to an unimproved end. Here's what Goethe told us. One should each day try to hear a little song, read a good poem, see a fine picture, and if it's possible, speak a few reasonable words. Here's what Socrates told us. The unexamined life is not worth living. And here is what the prophet Micah told us. What does the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God? And I can tell you, if I had the time, although you know it well enough, what Confucius, Isaiah, Jesus, Mohammed, the Buddha, Spinoza, and Shakespeare told us. It's all the same. There is no escaping from ourselves. The human dilemma is as it always has been, and we solve nothing fundamental by cloaking ourselves in technological glory and gorging ourselves with information. Even the humblest cartoon character knows this, and I will close by quoting the wise old possum named Pogo. I commend his words to all the technological utopians and messiahs present. We have met the enemy, Pogo said, and he is us. Thank you. Do we have?
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
In fact, I'll lead off with one.
I should say, Alan, I do feel a little the way Martin Luther must have felt addressing the bishops in Wittenberg.
You out of here alive.
Yes.
I'm on line after Al.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, we rarely in my childhood was I able to get up in church and ask the minister a question after the sermon. And so, what I'd like to ask you, I actually agree with quite a number of the things that you've said, as you know. I think that don't you think it's actually, and this is perhaps a mealy-mouthed way of putting it, but don't you think that what you're actually calling for is a better balance? Because obviously the Middle Ages had to have an information system of its own and ways of representing their beliefs, in which they found a more stable form, partly because they narrowed the universe down a bit. So humans don't get away from part of the inescapable thing of being humans is that we do have information systems of a sort. And I would liken your complaint much more to modern civilization being able to make as much fat and sugar and salt as we could possibly consume, because our bodies don't know how much fat and sugar and salt we should consume because we never had enough of it.
Well, I mean, I do agree. I mean, this perhaps would be the subject of a slightly different talk, but I do agree that a balance among media in a culture is much to be desired, and helps to keep, as Marshall McLuhan put it, our sensorium in a healthful condition. One of the objections I've previously made of television is that until recently, with the onslaught of computers, television had become the command center, it still is to some extent, of our whole culture. By which I mean that television would not be a special problem if it took its place as one of many media influencing people. But everything is out of balance now as other media expenses are moved to the periphery of the culture, and I think that is also dangerous. But still, we're stuck with the problem. It's not originated by the computer, but the computer, of course, amplifies it. Of what to do about this information glut. As we spoke yesterday, I didn't go into it here, but one of the filters against information glut has always been social institutions. Political parties, families, schools, religious systems. They have helped people to filter the information so they know what they should pay attention to and what they shouldn't pay attention to. A university catalog, for instance, is an information management system. By looking at a university catalog, you see what the professors think is worthwhile to study. And by what is not in the catalog, you see what the professors think is not worth studying. And this is a form of helping people manage information by knowing what is relevant and what isn't. Families do that, or used to anyway, by keeping secrets from the young, or having what used to be called values. Religious systems advise people and guide them as to what information they should pay attention to and what information they should ignore. I mentioned to a group yesterday that when I grew up, political parties were very important. They're not so important now. I think my students tell me they vote. When I ask them who they're going to vote for, they always say, well, I'll vote for the best person, which strikes me as an absurd idea. I don't think it strikes some of you as an absurd idea. I could tell from the expressions on your faces. Because the first time I was eligible to vote, I was for a mayor in New York City, and I had decided I would vote for this Republican. And I told this to my father, and he said, why? And I said, well, because the Democratic candidate is ignorant and corrupt. And my father said, but the Democratic candidates are always ignorant and corrupt. Do you want a Republican to win? I mean, that was the Democratic Party represented, we all believed in those days, our economic interests and sociological perspective. So we had a theory which helped us manage information. The theory was the Democratic Party represented us, and therefore we didn't have to pay any attention to anything a Republican said, which is nice. It spared us a lot of trouble, but there was also a modification to that. We would listen only to what Democrats said, but not Southern Democrats, because they were segregationists and racist, so we didn't have to pay attention to them. Well, the point I'm making is that the political parties are social institutions that also provide people with a sense of how to control information. Now, many of these social institutions are weakening, so that they are not authoritative in the minds of most people, which makes us then vulnerable in ways that we hadn't really quite anticipated. Yes, and then I think he goes, and then I'll, yes.
Yes.
No, I get it. Unfortunately, to
Why are you walking
respond
over there?
properly to you would take a book, and so here
Oh, thank you. Donald promised he'd give this.
I promised a book earlier. I mean, I really have to stand up because it's a sort of a theme. Because I've read your books with great delight, especially Amusing Ourselves to Death and Technopoly. And I agree with much of your arguments and your premises, but I really disagree quite fundamentally with your conclusions. That's why I'm standing up, to try to see if I can shorten this into a short statement. First of all, I think we live a much better life today than we ever did before, certainly than in the Middle Ages. Certainly I would not want to live as a king did even, let alone a common person. even 100 years ago. So our comfort, our physical comfort, our health, our intellectual comfort is far superior to what it ever was.
Well, I don't know about the intellectual comfort,
We have
but I
access to a richer variety of intellectual material. We are better educated as a nation. We may still say that our educational system is faulty and that we have a large amount of ignorance, but if you compare it again with the common people of earlier ages, look back over centuries, not over decades, over centuries. The next thing I think that you have misunderstood is, even though I think at one level you understand it, is how long it takes technological change to come about. So you spoke of the printing press being invented, and 40 years later, there were 140 presses. After
110, yeah.
110?
Yeah.
After 40 years, there were only about 100, right? And after another decade, yes, there were 8 million books published. You didn't say how many different titles, just how many total books. So that's 50 years. And of course, Gutenberg didn't really invent the printing press. He did was perfect it. So 50 years, well, gee, it hasn't really been 50 years since the advent of mass-scale television. So the impact of television, which you decry properly, is still a television in its bare infancy, which isn't anything like it's going to be like when it is mature. And as for the computer, again, I completely agree with all your analyses. You throw computers in the classroom, yeah, that's irrelevant and wrong. But give it another 50 or 100 years.
Are you quite finished, Donald?
I'm not. You get the theme.
No, there's just a couple of things. By the way, the most, on your point about television being fairly new, and of course the computer's fairly new, and therefore we may be talking nonsense, all of us, not just me, but even you guys, when we make the predictions. The most interesting fact about media, I know, is that that the printing press, generally thought to be invented about 1452, 3, and around there, depending, Donald, on who you want to claim as the inventor or the inventors. About, let's say, 1455. It isn't until the year 1516 that we get the first instance of pagination in books. And of course, once you number the pages in books, you change their function dramatically. And what's interesting to me about this is that I always thought if I had lived in Mainz in, say, 1455 and met Alan on the street, who also would have lived in Mainz, and Alan said to me, "Did you hear what Gutenberg has done?" And then went on and said he can print books with this machine, millions of them. I always fancied that I would say, "Listen, Alan, when you see Gutenberg, tell him not to forget to number the pages." It seems so obvious, doesn't it? But it took about 65 years before anyone thought of numbering the pages. So you're quite right, Donald. I mean, it's on that point that there could be someone being born in San Jose as we speak now who will find uses of either television or, for that matter, computers that no one living right at this moment could possibly conceive of, and yet 200 years down the line, it will seem so obvious to everyone, they will wonder how come we could have missed it. So I agree with that point. Just one other thing about your claim that our lives are much better today. I mean, there's certainly through inventions in sanitation and pharmacology and a few other fields we could mention, possibly nutrition and agriculture, or not possibly, almost certainly, we could say that we're better off. But I don't think we should slip so easily from saying that we're better off materially, and then, as you started to add, intellectually. You didn't say emotionally, but I mean, we could easily slip into that. And And I'm not sure. I mean, remember, Thoreau said, writing in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, when it was obvious that we were going to be improving our material lives, that most men live lives of quiet desperation. 1 out of every 9 Americans will now spend some time in a mental institution or under care for psychiatric fixings. Alzheimer's creeps up from time to time. The most common cause of death, Donald, among adolescents in America is, the second most common cause is suicide. Part of the problem, and I know you has a question back there, I just want to add this one thought. We probably don't have time to go into it here, but I implied it in my talk that the people who lived in an earlier time at least had some comprehensive stories, I call them narratives, that help to give purpose and meaning to their lives. Of course, for most people, it comes from their religious system. The great story of Genesis is a great narrative, and Americans used to have some wonderful narratives. What bothered the 2 questions every human being wants answered. In fact, they're almost the first 2 questions children ask when they get language. Where did I come from, and what's going to happen after I die? These questions never go away. And good Genesis has some wonderful answers to that. Now, what's science's answer? How did it all start? Science says it was an accident. How's it going to end? Science says, and technology, probably by an accident. Well, there are a lot of people, Donald, a lot of people, maybe more than you suspect, who believe that the accidental life is not worth living. And they search for new stories to find that will give them purpose and meaning. So, I mean, I agreed with a lot that you said, but I just wanted to make a caveat about that point. Now, there was someone in the back. Yes.
To go back to the main topic of your talk, I probably am here because I like to align myself with the children and other self-deluders of the world. And a lot of what you say goes to the fact that people are deluged by information that they didn't choose. CBS doesn't particularly hold my point of view. And if we, a lot of what we're trying to do, I think, is make computers, let computers make people into active seekers of information, people that go to libraries and things like that, rather than people that sit passively in front of a TV set. Does this compromise your view?
No, it doesn't, because the other side, this would be the subject of a more congenial talk, if I'm ever invited.
I'm partly to blame for this topic.
If I'm ever invited back, but that sometimes I think, and I mean, even with my limited knowledge of what computers, at least so far, seem to be capable of, I sometimes think that the computer, far from introducing the age of information, may be the instrument that leads to the end of the age of information. I think you can actually make a case that the printing press begins the age of information and then computer technology will end it in this sense. When I used in my talk the metaphor of AIDS, I'd like that to be taken sort of seriously for a minute here, that our immune, so long, Donna, thanks. Our immune system operates to get rid of unwanted cells. Cellular growth is a normal process. When it gets out of control, our immune system kills, destroys the unwanted cells and keeps the organism healthy. So, I use the term cultural AIDS Because what I meant to say was that you can, just as your survival can be threatened by too little information, it may be your survival can be threatened by too much, unless you have some kind of immune system, using this metaphorically, to get rid of unwanted information. And this, in the end, may be what the computer can do best for us, to give us a kind of... Now you see what I mean? I rest my case. Is that... See, I had processed that Donald had left, and that was all right with me.
Donald needed more information.
Yeah, he needed more. So I think that may be. By the way, I also think, this would also be in a different speech, that the computer may come, this gets back to Alan's point about balance, may have come just at the right time as an ally of the printed word or the written word, in that in order to at least program a computer or think about what you folks think about, you have to think about thinking, which in itself is a very analytic process and not so very different from the kinds of processes when we experience when we're dealing with writing. So that here come all these visual media like television, movies, photography, mass advertising, which in a way are hostile to the state of mind of the writing person. And along comes the computer possibly just in time to restore balance. So that could happen too. That's not inevitable. You know, and as Donald said, we can never be sure. A lot would depend on what we do with it and how we think about it. Now there was, yes, Ms.
Well, I think that is a critical question, what we do with it. I guess I would argue that I'm not convinced that communication technology, even though I do think it shapes how we think and interact and behave, is the culprit in and of itself. I would argue that it's something much bigger, which has been defined as postmodernism or post-structuralism. But for the sake of this argument, I would like to ask whether you know of any research that has been done to look at the effect of how electronic media affects our thinking vis-a-vis reading. Reading is linear and sequential. It's private, it's individual. You can fantasize, as you and McLuhan has written about. What are the implications of a technology in terms of how we think about the world? And I agree that I think that TV is technologically or cognitively regressive compared to reading. But does the computer have a different way of shaping how we think about the world in a non-linear, not necessarily non-sequential way? And is that cognitively regressive or comparable?
Well, I don't know enough. I mean, when I sit around Alan's house eating bagels and drinking coffee and listen to him, he spins a tale of how computer technology in the future will help to provide us with a different worldview and help us think thoughts that we cannot think now. Just as writing and then printing eventually did. So I don't know the answer to this. We're going to discover it. But one of the Alan's already called my talk a sermon, and I think he's right. But one of my catechisms here would be what we all need then. Coming off your question is what Paul Goodman called some technological modesty. We have to proceed very carefully.
But in addition, an ethic, which you only touched on, and which seems to me to be implicitly part of of a kind of control of information or content or thinking or whatever within a vacuum, within a framework, not a moral or ethical vacuum, which it seems to me could be the downside of what you're saying. Who's the authority? Who's going to maintain control? Who has the database? And in whose interests? Those are questions I
Well,
think.
yeah, no, I mean, we're kindred spirits here.
One place you might, there's a guy by the name of Gabriel Salomon. He's done many, many studies of
Yeah.
large-scale effects of television on thinking patterns and stuff. And that might be a place
Yeah,
to start.
here's the way I would like to think about it. So let's imagine it were it's 1905. And let's imagine that it's 1905, but we know in 1905 what we now know about the combustion engine, the automobile. And we made on a chalkboard a list of the advantages and disadvantages. The advantages would be many. So would the disadvantages. I mean, we'll poison our air, choke our cities, tear down destroy some of the beauty of our natural landscape, create the suburbs. Some of you would put that over there. I put it over here. But anyway, we made a list. And then we said to our country men and women, okay, we know what is going to happen. Shall we go ahead with this? Let's have a plebiscite. Well, most Americans looking at this, I think, would say, oh shit, let's do it. Right? But there is someone who is likely to say, yeah, let's do it, but is there something we can do through education, through political action, through social policy to maximize the good stuff and minimize the negative consequences? Well, in 1905, there would have been plenty we could have done. And 1915 and 1935, maybe even 1955. By 1995, it's too late. Los Angeles being the most horrible example of almost everything, by the way. But in this case, I mean a culture.
Hey, the bagels are pretty good.
Yeah, they are. In this case, I mean a culture that is controlled by the automobile. I mean, you can't do anything anymore. Now, in 1946, if someone could have said, look, let's imagine, because you never can know, but let's speculate, let's think together about what television will give us and what it will take from us. Is there anything we could do to make this richer and to minimize this? Well, in 46, there were things we could do, but no one paid any attention to this. With computers now, we're going through the same damn thing. No one is educating the public, not with the razzmatazz and not with all the magnificent wonders, but someone say, well, our best guess is that these might be the cognitive effects on our children. This is how it might affect our schools and so on. Over here, this maybe will become more, automatons or something of that. I mean, I'm just making this up. It would depend on people like you who really know about this to inform us, to help us speculate. Then, of course, we would always have to say, look, but there are unforeseen consequences. We're doing the best we can.
But I'm an outsider. I'm a teacher educator that slipped into this environment.
Yeah, me too.
So.
Yes, sir.
You've spoken a great deal about information, and one of your parallels has been the printing press. I wonder what you think about communication and parallel, which I think is pretty strong, that of the computer to the telephone. If I might cite one small example, online services and bulletin boards. It's really not information services that thrive, but email. it's communication. And I think that's a very important point that hasn't really been brought up.
Well, I'm kind of suspicious. I got, Alan really was trying to educate me yesterday about email. But I'm a little suspicious. By the way, I'm a little suspicious about the telephone. For example, we did some research. You know, when the telephone rings, anyway, in your house, probably in your business too, but people almost, they can't resist picking it up, which I think is a problem. I mean, we've discovered people actually making love. We call it telephonus interruptus. Will actually stop making love to answer the telephone, which I think is sort of psychopathic. But there's a AT&T says, I think it must be AT&T, reach out and touch someone. I think this is very dangerous because you can't reach out and touch someone with the telephone. If Dolores, she's got a broken wrist, so I won't ask her to come up, but if she did come up, I would show you what it means to reach out and touch someone. Do you understand what I'm saying? We've changed the meaning of reaching out and touching someone. It's just talking on the telephone. It's different from reaching out and touching someone. As a matter of fact, on your values, there was this wonderful, my students actually walked out after I gave them this question. They were so disgusted with me. They thought I was so stupid. There was a telephone commercial that went like this. It shows this young woman in England someplace, setting is in England, and she's leaving her father to go to America. And the father is giving her a brooch. And I don't know if anyone remembers this commercial, and he's saying to her, Helen, your mother, it's obvious the mother has died recently, would have wanted you to have this brooch in your new life. Meanwhile, you hear the husband, there's a taxi, so Helen will miss the plane. And she takes the brooch and she starts to cry and they hug. This is done like in first 20 seconds. Then the next scene, you see the father sitting alone in his cottage. He's looking very depressed. And the telephone rings. He says, Helen! She's in like Los Angeles now. Helen! Oh, it's so good to hear from you. Now the question I asked my students was, why is this woman leaving her father? See, you didn't think of this question. The man just lost his wife. He's alone. Why is his daughter leaving him? See, this is where values comes in. Now, AT&T wants the daughter to leave him, right? Obviously, because the more daughters that leave their parents, the more they can reach out and touch people. Now, on the email, this magazine, because Seymour Papert is thought of, you know, and this is dumb, but I mean, he's thought of as a pro-technology guy. And then I'm thought of as an anti-technology guy. So this magazine, American Agenda, said, oh, you and Seymour, he's in a vacation in Maine. I said, but I'm going to be on the West Coast. Guy says, no problem. Said, I want you and Seymour to have a conversation, mostly about his new book, The Children's Machine, about which I do want to say just one thing before we end. So a guy said, well, email, you can have a conversation. I said, this is not a conversation. He said, what do you mean? I said, this is not a conversation. We are typing things to each other. And then he said, you know, Seymour could say something, and then you could think about it, like the next day, come back and answer it. I said, that's some conversation. If I'm talking with Alan, and he tells me something that I said, well, Alan, I'll come back tomorrow and answer you, because he's going to say I'm not here tomorrow, and that's the end of our conversation. Here's one of the most interesting things. Here's what I'm driving at. I know this is sort of long-winded, but technology changes the meanings of fundamental words. See, what Alan mentioned Socrates. What Socrates was afraid of was that writing would change the meaning of intelligence by downgrading the importance of memory. To a Greek in the 5th century BC in Athens, especially a Greek youth, intelligence and memorization were virtually the same thing.
Do you think they should be?
Well, I mean, in an oral culture, it has to be, because those kids had to learn by heart the Iliad and the Odyssey and other epic poetry by heart. Now, the smartest kid in San Jose, I mean, you ask him to memorize Hiawatha and Paul Revere's Ride, and he's out of business. But he would say, why do I have to do this? If you want to know the poems, I'll go to the library and get it. As a consequence, people, writing people, certainly printing people, do not place such a high value on memorization, because it just doesn't seem that important to us. In an oral tradition, aphorisms, proverbs, sayings, which contain the accumulated wisdom of the centuries, are very important. Most of us regards aphorisms and proverbs as silly language. I mean, can you imagine a courtroom where the jury comes back and the judge says, have you reached a verdict? And the foreman says, yes, we have, Your Honor. To err is human, to forgive divine. The judge would say, what the hell is this? You better go back and come back with some straight answers here. But there are people who, I mean, Solomon, in Kings 1, it says, it says Solomon was the wisest of men. King Solomon. Why? Because he knew 3,000 proverbs. Now, if we did monitored our, I know about 6. Right? I mean, a rolling stone gathers no moss. I don't know how, maybe someone really good might know 15. By the way, it's very interesting. The only place in a print culture.
I have 4,300 in here.
You do? Yeah. Good. That's good. I love you know where there's one context in which print people, writing people, still take proverbs seriously, that is not as ornaments of language, but as some sort of fundamental way of expressing. And it's interesting, it's with children. Every parent knows, if this one wants to sit in the front, and the brother also wants to sit in the front. And the problem the parent usually has is to find some proverb, basically, or saying, piece of wisdom, that will satisfy both people, the brother and the sister. I don't know what it would be. First come, first served? No, that'll continue the hostility. There must be something that says, what's fair is fair. I don't know. I'm so limited in the proverbs. But I mean, most of us don't think proverbs and sayings are important. Oral people do. There's an old saying, I'm sure you've heard it, that says, to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Right? So I guess you could say, to a man with a pencil, everything looks like a sentence. Maybe to a person with a computer, everything looks like data. I don't know. To a person with a camera, everything looks like an image. We do know, I mean, you asked for research, but we do know, it's hard to pin down, but we know that the dominant media of a culture tends to create for people a certain worldview. And on language, things like what is truth, what is intelligence, what is law, what is good, what is bad, these things are altered by new technologies. To the Greeks, memorization was part of the critical in intelligence. To us, it isn't important. We like detachment. We used to like detachment. How the hell would a kid in Athens in 430 BC memorize the Iliad and the Odyssey? How would that be possible? The only conjecture that we have from Eric Havelock in his book on the origins of Western literacy is that they must have learned it the way an actor today learns a part. That is, by putting themselves in it, not being distanced from the text, but being Achilles. So that probably is the only way you could learn that sort of thing. But when we teach in the school now, we don't want kids that close to the text. We say we want you to be analytical, detached, to be able to look at the text from a distance. Now that's the person. So what I was driving at is things like what touching people is, what a conversation is, are altered by media change. And when people say, well, you'll adapt to it, what do they mean when they say, well, they've adapted to this? My guess is what it means is that you've learned to become a somewhat different kind of person to function that way. I mean, a debate, take the word debate. Well, I've written about the Lincoln-Douglas debates. You all know about that. I mean, this was a Lincoln-Douglas debate. And they start in Springfield, Illinois. Lincoln would speak for 3 hours, Douglas 3 hours. Then Lincoln would have an hour to, refute, or what's the word? Rebut, thank you. And then they go to the next town, Ottawa, Illinois, and then Douglas would do 3 hours, Lincoln 3 hours, and Douglas would have an hour to rebut. Now, what has television done to the word debate? There's Bush and there's Clinton. And Barbara Walters or someone says to Bush, President Bush, well, what do you think is the problem and the solution to the Middle East hostilities? You have 2 minutes to answer, after which Governor Clinton will have 1 minute to rebut. Now, I would say, because I'm, as you can tell, an old fuddy-duddy, if these two guys were actually sane, and I almost mean that literally, they would turn to Barbara Walters and say, where the hell do you come off asking a question like this? We're running to be President of the United States. How dare you ask us to address a question like this in 2 minutes and the other one to rebut in a minute? Or they might say, what kind of people do you think the American electorate is, that they would take this charade seriously? Well, they don't ask either question. And one of the reasons they don't ask is that this has already been defined by television as a debate. 2 minutes to answer and 1 minute to rebut. So what do we say to each other? Listen, you're going to watch the debate tonight, and when it's over, listen, what did you think of the debate? Well, there's another definition from an earlier time of debate, but television is changing that. Email is going to change what we mean by communication and intimacy and conversation. I'm not speaking against this. That is inevitable. Media change the meanings of our most profound words. All I would say is, if we're going to do something about media education in the Unified School District, those kids should be studying the history and social effects of technology. So that, I mean, who gives a shit if they become computer 35 million people have already learned how to use computers, and not from school. So that'll continue. But they have to have perspective on it. They have to know what's happening to them in their culture. And then, who knows? I mean, they may, Socrates was an old fuddy-duddy. And he said 3 things. He said, I hate writing. writing is going to do these three things. It's going to destroy our memories, which it did. It's going to change the dialectic process, as Alan mentioned, you know, that wonderful line about it forces a student to follow an argument rather than participate in it. And then he said it'll destroy our sense of privacy. By the way, email does that, I believe. Because Socrates says whenever you write something down, you never know whose eyes will fall on it. The person for whom it's intended, but just as likely someone for whom it is not. So he said, to hell with it. Now, Plato, of course, wrote all this down. So he knew this. But he also Plato was much in favor of writing because he knew that the Athenians were using too much intellectual energy memorizing everything. He also knew there's got to be a shift from the ear to the eye, which is why the legend has it over his academy. It said, "None dare enter who knows not geometry." Because geometry is a visual system. And he was trying to reorient people to the eye. I'm very oriented to the eye. I don't think my students are. It's very interesting. Where if someone has something, they say, "Oh, here's a letter. Let me read it to you," against writing. Plato was for it, but he did say in his 7th letter, no philosopher in his right mind, for the reasons you... no, he had another reason, Alan. He said, no philosopher in his right mind will ever write down his philosophy. And his reason was that once you write something down, you're kind of stuck with it forever, even if you don't die, you know, because then people can find you, like Donald found me, and then said, you know, I don't agree with you. And then if you say, you know, I don't agree with me anymore either, he's likely to say, you know, this guy's a hypocrite. The guy wrote this stuff, and then I found the flaws in it, and when I present it to him, he says, yeah, that's all right. You know, what kind of writer is this? So Plato knew that this is a problem, but still he felt the advantages to writing, of course, were mainly in creating science and what truth is. Socrates says the unexamined life is not worth living. In other words, this is the oral person saying, look into yourself. And by the time Aristotle comes, and you know, they say Aristotle created nature. What they mean by that is he developed the taxonomy, a visual representation of nature. So Aristotle basically is saying, no, it's not the unexamined life that's not worth living. It's the unexamined world. So he wants to look out, and Plato understood that this is what writing would bring. But Socrates said, no. The oral tradition is speech, and only speech is the authentic medium for poetry, for intimacy, for piety. And if you distance yourself with those symbols, you'll become a different kind of person. Well, we became a different kind of person. And with printing, we still, again, became a different kind of person. Television is making us a different kind of person. Computers will still make us a different kind of person. But Alan likes to say, and I like this a lot, that television should be the last technology we will allow to have been invented and promoted mindlessly. That, okay, we just didn't know that much. So we got television, and it's changed our culture, but that's it. From now on, every technology we have to think about. Now, who do we depend on to help us think about it? The people, let's say in the case of computers, who know a lot about it. One of the reasons I like Weizenbaum, I know he's not the most popular person perhaps, is that he really was the first computer scientist who raised questions about some of the negative consequences. Before that, if someone like me did it, there was always some real smart computer maven, you know, who was 19 years old, usually, who would say, well, what the hell, you don't know enough about computers. And then I'd have to shrink back, recognizing the justice of that. But when Weizenbaum spoke about it, see, Papert could say to me, you don't know enough about computers, and he'd be right. And I'd have to listen. But he can't say that to Joseph Weizenbaum. So we rely on people who are experts to have the kind of perspective that will help educators as well as citizens evaluate what kind of people they are expected to become if this technology develops mindlessly without, if it develops sans a political and social context. Finally, I did want to say about Seymour's book. He said the same thing in Mindstorms. I thought it was funny. You know about logo, right? Everyone knows about it. And he says in Mindstorms, he's going to eliminate mathophobes, right? But he says what you have to do is revolutionize the classroom. You've got to change the psychic environment of a classroom. So it's a place where children are not afraid, for example, to make mistakes. Where a classroom where everyone believes, in fact, you learn by mistakes. It's almost good to make mistakes, because that's how you learn. And then okay. Now the point is, if you had such a classroom, you wouldn't need a goddamn computer. You could teach kids anything. I've done it, and I've seen other teachers do it. Of course, Logo has gone into many classrooms, and Roy P. and others have tested to see if the claims Seymour made for it happened, and finds out that they don't happen. The Logo kids aren't much different from, the control groups. And so now in Seymour's new book, The Children's Machine, he says, well, of course, nothing showed up. Because we didn't make you put it just in a regular classroom. But you need this kind of teacher and this kind of psychic setup for people to learn. Well, computers are expensive. If I had teachers creating such a classroom, why the hell would I need a computer? You can teach kids almost anything if you create an environment which facilitates their learning, in which they're not afraid to learn and not penalized every which way for making a mistake. Well, this is a question, I'm sure if Seymour were here, he'd have plenty to say back to me, and then he would say, you don't know enough about computers, and then I say, Weizenbaum, where are you when I need you? But we have to make, you're a teacher, so am I, we have to make judgments about what kind of people we will create if, let's say, we get a personal computer for every 2 kids in a classroom. What's it going to do to their minds? We have to think about it. So we have to rely on people who know a lot about this to be disinterested enough. It doesn't mean that, I know Apple and other computer companies have to make money. Why not? But still, we need people who are disinterested enough so that they can advise us on what are likely to be the advantages and what are to be the disadvantages, and then we can proceed to make decisions whether this means buying or not buying one for our home, or buying or not buying one for our classrooms, or whatever. Anyway, there was one final question, and then we'll end, okay?
I just wondered if there's any technologies that are embedded in your lives. For instance, do you bicycle or use a typewriter?
Well, I do. I actually, I have I like this. I've written 20 books, and I use this and a yellow pad. I find it user-friendly. I find that it's passed the test of time. It's also inexpensive. Now, my students say that I should use a word processor, and I ask them why, And well, one of them said, well, with the spell check, you know, and I said, but I know how to spell. So then this guy said, well, you could take a paragraph from page 12 and move it in a jiffy to page 2. And I say, I never take a paragraph from page 12 and move it to 2. It's like a sign of a disordered mind to do that. But what I do, how I do it, is I write, you know, by hand on a yellow sheet, do all my editing that way, and then up until the last book I did, that is the first 19, I would then take my old Smith Corona portable and type up what I more or less construed to be the last draft. But the last book, one of the secretaries said she can't stand my doing this. So she would type it for a small fee, and she'd put it on the word processor. So that now, of course, I do use cars, and I just bought a new Honda, and this guy who sold me the Honda said he wanted me to pay extra money for cruise control. And I said, what's cruise control? I mean, I knew, but and he said, oh, this is great. You can press this button, and it'll keep steady and you don't have to put your foot on the accelerator. And I said, well, you know, I've been driving for 35 years, and I've never thought it a burden to keep my foot on the accelerator. Why the hell should I pay $180 for? And then he wanted to sell me, well, you almost have to buy electric windows. I said I didn't find this a burden in my life either. But he thought I was strange. But listen, I'm not. Just one book I want to recommend on this. I mean, I'm not a Luddite in quotes. I mean, I understand Donald's point of the wonders and blessings that technology has brought us. In fact, I do quote in Technopoly C.P. Snow's line that the Industrial Revolution was the best hope of the poor, which was almost everybody. So, I mean, I understand that, and the first couple of chapters of that book is sort of a celebration of the material benefits that technology has brought. But now technology, I'm trying to say, has become problematic. I think now we have to get control over it. I wanted to recommend an interesting book. Some of you have probably heard of it. It's called Giving Up the Gun. How many of you have heard of this book? It's by Noel Perrin, P-E-R-R-I-N. I thought of it when I thought to say that I'm not a Luddite, and that you know how people are always saying you can't turn the technological clock back? Well, actually, it was done once in Japan. In the 16th century, the Japanese were the largest, or among the largest manufacturers in the world of cannon and guns, matchlock guns. This was a problem for many social systems, including the value system of the samurai, who believed shooting a person to death was totally dishonorable. For reasons of their own, slicing his head off face to face was honorable. But they could see that the gun was going to change drastically the value system, not only of the samurai, but of many other related systems. And so in about 1560, the Japanese gave up the gun. They destroyed their guns. They threw them away. The whole culture did. In fact, various governments paid gun makers, you know, subsidized them the way we do farmers not to grow corn. They subsidized them not to make guns, which was very profitable, and instead to make swords. And for 200 years, there were no guns in Japan. So it's just sort of interesting that there was of course this can't happen. The only thing I could think of comparable, I don't know, maybe the SST. Remember the SST? When we were going to spend billions to build it, and people thought about it, and said, what's the advantage of the SST? It can get you from New York to LA instead of 6 hours, 3 hours, maybe 2.5. What would we do with the other 3.5 hours? We'd watch television. So we can watch that here. Besides, they put television on the plane anyway, so you can watch. And then we kind of voted it down in a way. And I'm wondering, this $50 billion network that Gore and Clinton are interested in, information highway, I have only one question that I'd like to ask Vice President Gore. To what is the question, or what is the problem to which this $50 billion network is the answer? Now, so far I haven't heard any, unless one says, well, new technologies or technological innovation development fuel the economy. Well, that's an answer of sorts. We have to keep doing this to keep people working. But I don't know that there's a social or intellectual problem to which that $50 billion network is the solution. But I mean, these are questions, because I said to this guy who wanted to sell me cruise control, what is the problem to which cruise control is the solution? And he said, you don't have to keep your foot on the accelerator. I said, well, that's not a problem. Unless you convince people that it's a problem. What is the problem to which electric windows is the solution? Doing this with your arm. Well, that doesn't seem to me to be a problem, unless in Dolores' case you have a broken arm. Then it would be, but how many drivers are going around with broken arms? I think that's a terrific question to ask, by the way. With any new technology, what is the problem to which this technology claims to be the solution? If Seymour Papert is claiming that the computer is the solution to the problem of how to get children to be self-directing and not to be fearful in class, he may have something, but at least we have to consider it. I don't think it's the answer to that problem, but I'm willing to entertain the possibility that it could contribute to solving it, because he does say in the book, you know, he praises John Dewey and the others who formulated the new ways of thinking about learning in classrooms, but says the problem is when the progressive educators were devising their notions, they didn't have the technology to realize it. And then he uses the example that Leonardo thought of the airplane, but the technology didn't exist, nor the physics, to make it a reality. Then the Wright brothers come, the physics are there, and the material is there, and they could do it. So Seymour hints that, well, we had the Dewey had the right idea, but we had to wait until the computer came to make it possible to have an open, free, fear-less classroom. Yeah, final remark and then we'll go.
The kind of prediction that you were talking about, like the consequences of the automobile in 1905, I think it's extremely hard to do and extremely hard to be sure that you're right. And I wondered how you thought about science fiction as a ground in which to try this out on.
Well, terrific. I mean, McLuhan used to say artists were the people we should pay special attention to get insight into these future things. Because, you know, he used the rear view mirror analogy that the rest of us are driving along trying to see where we're going by looking in the rear view mirror. And he thought that our best artists are those who are looking straight ahead, you know, through the windshield so they can see. Now, that takes an educated imagination for us to know what they're trying to tell us. But sure, I think science fiction and other kinds of artistic expression, as well as their other modes, where we have to take our best guesses. I mean, it is a new world, and we're into things that no one even knows. I mean, we're just beginning to figure out about pharmacology we've been giving. I sometimes think, I mean, this is strict. I mean, this is sort of maybe even a dopey idea, but with this AIDS epidemic, that they say our immune systems, are breaking down. I'm just wondering if this is not happening because of all the antibiotics people have been taking for now 50 years. And now it's showing up suddenly, people's immune system breaks down. I mean, this may be, in quotes, what they used to call a side effect, which turns out now to be the main effect. But I mean, it is all new stuff that we're getting into, and we have to take our best conjectures as to where it's leading and whether we want to go this way. Of course, it may be, we may be all wrong, but I think we have to try. Thank you very much.